Hospopreneurs. Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Hospopreneurs podcast. Today we have a chat with Matt Kirkegaard, who shares an incredible amount of wisdom on the beer industry. We focus predominantly on the consumer end, innovation, growth, marketing and development over his 15-year career, and debunk a few marketing gimmicks while exploring craft beer and discuss what ultimately makes a good brew. Another little note I'd like to make is that most podcasts, I think it's 19 out of 20, don't make it through episode 7. That's the final one that they reach. So thank you for all of your support, and I'm looking forward to our future episodes together. And without further ado, let's get into the episode. Cheers. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Oh, my absolute pleasure, James. Thanks for asking me to come along.
No worries at all. No worries at all. So, guys, we've got Matt Kirkegaard in today, who is known in the online community as Good Beer Matt. And Matt, we'll delve into that a little bit further. But Matt, you just got back from London. What were you doing over there?
Yeah, look, just I was very lucky. My partner was over there for a month, and so it was having the accommodation sorted. It was too good an opportunity not to go over and check out the beer scene over there. Just get a sense for whether what's happening here is happening in London as well.
Interesting, right? So what is it that you do, Matt?
Oh God, it's if it's got beer in it, I tend to be involved in some way. I'm actually a journalist by training and started writing about beer about 15 years ago. But since then, I'm like the guy that was wearing flares for so long that they came back into fashion. So beer wasn't craft beer then. Beer was just beer.
You were the original hipster.
Yeah, no. That's the other thing is that the current beer revolution. It's about the only time that fashion and I have vaguely coincided in the same time and place. So I've been very lucky, and yeah, I was writing about beer when it was very, very uncool, and it just happened to come into fashion at a time that I was very unfashionable.
Right. Right. So obviously 15 years, that's a crazy journey. So how did you get into writing about beer?
Yeah, as I said, I was a journalist and I was working in communications for the government and doing media releases and ministerial media releases and speeches. And, it's not the most intellectually stimulating or creative job. So I was freelance writing just on weekends just to, keep those writing muscles developed. And when you're doing it as a freelance thing, as a bit of a hobby, you write about things that you're interested in, and that was food and popular culture and beer, which I had a real interest in. So I was writing about beer, and when you're writing about something and people take notice of it, so I had brewers starting to send me beer, or if I was going to visit one of the relatively few breweries on holidays, I'd say, look, I'm a writer and I write about beer, and send a few articles, and you'd get the access all the areas tour. So it was a pretty cool thing to do back then. And it just happened that I was one of the few people who was writing about beer. It seemed that every magazine and pretty much every school newsletter had somebody writing about wine, but there weren't many people writing about beer. And there was just this gradual awakening of interest in beer, and I had by that stage had a few runs on the board.
Right. So would you say that it was really down to coincidence that you just enjoyed talking about beer, and that you got into it at that time when other people started getting into it as well, or was there something, any techniques or anything that you used to really build your name and get it out there, get the word out there?
Well, initially, because it was a hobby, it was just out of interest. It's where my interests lay, and so I was writing as much out of interest. But then, there is a little bit of self-interest that becomes that, gee, maybe I can get some free beer out of this. I'm writing some articles. So it was just purely amateur like that. But as it developed, if you go back 15 years ago, there were very few craft breweries. I think we've got over 400 now. But there was 20 to 25 back then. And in Queensland, people were drinking Forex. 4X was just the national, it was just the state beer.
Mm.
And when you're writing about beer styles, and I wasn't at all interested in writing about what were the mainstream beers there because there's not a lot to say about them. But I was writing about German Hefeweizens or Belgian wit beers or what was just starting to emerge as a style with the American Pale Ale.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're writing about beers that are have hints of passion fruit or banana and clove and, made with coriander and orange peel, and the people that are reading them are drinking 4X, they're sniffing their beer and going, oh, gee, what's this bloke on about? I'm not getting banana in this.
Yeah.
And you would get that feedback from what you're writing. So I figured that, well, it's a little bit like trying to write about a sunset and the person who's reading it is colorblind. They don't have the frame of reference. So I started just hosting informal beer tastings as well. And that was where the second element of what I now do came about. I was, figured that it's easier to give somebody a beer to taste than read about it. And so, I started doing tastings and beer and food matching tastings that were very hard work back in those days, because in those days, beer and pizza or beer and beer nuts were considered a great match, or just a standard match. And so it was starting to, there were other people doing it. Chuck Hahn was certainly out there doing it, but there weren't many people who were doing it at that stage. And so it was almost making the market that you could, then people would read your writing, or, it was just all a little bit hand in hand, trying to develop the market and trying to communicate these beers. And then as new breweries started up, they would get in touch and say, hey, we've got this new brewery. And so there was this whole, I'd like to flatter myself and say that I was a little bit involved in creating an awareness of beers when there wasn't much, that helped to plough the field that brewers then started to come into. And I've certainly had a couple of brewers who have come up to me, or people that are now in the industry, say, I came to one of your dinners 10 years ago and I realised that, hey, there's something to this, or my interest was shared by other people.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
Yeah, look, and it's really nice feedback when you sort of think that you have done something. But again, it's not. Again, it's a very, very small role. But there were a lot of people starting to come out of the woodwork, and we started to see the industry have a bit of momentum. And I've just been lucky enough to, as that's happened, I guess because I was first, and I also had some great opportunities as a result of that I've managed to shape that into a career.
That's fantastic, and that's really, really awesome feedback to hear from those guys, and it'll make you feel great knowing that all the hard work that you put in over that time pays off. So yeah, that's really, really cool. Did you work in hospitality at all before you went into writing about beer?
Well, I think like everyone, I started off in hospo. My first job was at the Regatta Hotel.
Oh, nice.
When I was at uni, God, that was old school Regatta Hotel, and before workplace health and safety. I remember the manager then. I was a glassy and working on weekends, and that was back in the days of the Sunday session where there was, I think it was 10 to 12, and then 2 till 4 were the hours on a Sunday.
Right.
And so you had a split shift. You'd go and glassy, and then in between you had to clean toilets. And God, I remember one day being perched up on the upper balcony with a fire hose in one hand and my arm wrapped around the post, hosing out the gutters by reaching up above my head. So it was, that was, I mean, that's going back 30 years.
You've been in the trenches.
That was old school glassing, but it's certainly changed now. But I've never, apart from, doing the uni student bar stuff, I've certainly never been a professional bar person, no.
I think, but even among professional, cocktail bartenders, it's certainly respected that people have been in the trenches, like that. I think everyone should have to have mopped up a toilet. I think so. I think that's just
absolutely.
a thing.
I did a lot of that.
Yeah. So I totally get that. If we sort of bring it closer to the present, can you just tell our listeners what sort of publications you've written for or been published by now?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've written for airline magazines around the world. I used to edit Beer and Brewer magazine that still trundles on. I founded a publication called Australian Brews News.
Hmm.
That's an online beer news website.
I'll send a link. I'll put a link up for those guys as well.
Yeah,
For you
sure.
there. Yep.
I've written for the Courier Mail.
Hmm.
Written for American and English beer magazines. I've contributed to books. Some of the books that have been published in the vein of the famous beer writer Michael Jackson. That they've been picked up, and I've been the Australian contributor to a number of those.
Hmm.
Yeah, look, it just pretty much have keyboard will travel.
Yeah, that's fantastic too. I just sort of wanted to give our listeners who might not have heard of you more of an indication as to what you've been doing more recently or even over that 15 years that you mentioned. That's an incredibly you'd have an incredibly wide and varied experience in that time. So yeah, I just wanted to bring everyone up to speed. I also noticed on your website you mentioned the Alliance Hotel. Are you working together with those guys?
I don't work for them. Look, I just think that in terms of what I do, again, just to take a step back, it's always been really hard trying to convince people to take beer and food seriously. And
Mm-hmm.
Nick Grigorski, who's the publican up there, he contacted me a couple of years ago when he bought the venue, and it was like a dive before he bought it. Hopefully, previous publicans aren't owning it, but the first time I went there was in the late '90s, and it was a lunchtime strip club upstairs. I can't remember if it was a goth nightclub or a gay bar downstairs, and the public bar was just a sort of place that was an old school public bar with guys with TAB guides in their back pockets nursing a light ice, hoping that they can get a win and buy their next beer.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick took it over with a real vision for what he wanted to do, and he didn't want to be a scratch bar or a cutting edge craft beer bar, but he
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to mainstream craft beer, and he had a really great vision for what he wanted to do for the wanted to put a restaurant quality bistro
Mm-hmm.
in and have great pub food, and he did that. And he was just very open to my dreams of doing beer and food matching. So it just happened that I didn't have to convince him to let me throw some crazy ideas at what he was doing, and the food that he was doing was just so good that it was a lovely match for the beer. So we've never actually had a formal association, but he just lets me play out some of my crazy ideas there, and some of them have come off and some of them haven't quite, but it's just been a great partnership, but very, very informal.
Yeah, good. Those sort of innovative synergies, I suppose, between what you're both interested in.
Yeah, well, I mean, he is a publican that realizes that he's in hospitality, and hospitality
Mm.
isn't just sticking craft beer on tap and expecting if you build it they will come, or if I stick craft beer on I'm just going to get people coming in and drinking it. Craft beer is one offering of a contemporary hospitality experience, and food and great function spaces and a welcoming atmosphere are all part of that. And
Hmm.
he's just got a really forward-thinking approach to it.
Good. That having that holistic perspective. Um,
Yeah.
I wanted to. Something came up in episode three with JD on the show here, and he told us a little bit about the beer basics. But for a quick recap, what are the types of beers out there, and how they different, and what makes an ale different to a lager, for example?
Okay, well, look, I mean, I was going to say how many different types are there. I mean, I think there's 80 or 90 recognized
Mm.
styles of beer, and they're being added to every year. When I say added to, a whole lot of historical styles are being reinvigorated and rediscovered, and so adding to and then brewers are starting to cross-pollinate and hybridize and just go weird and wacky, and eventually they're creating new styles. But to go back to ales and lagers, really comes down to the yeast. At its heart, and I caught the JD podcast. So
Hmm.
at its heart, malt, water, hops, and yeast to beer.
Hmm.
And then it depends on which yeast you use as to whether it's an ale or a lager. And ale yeasts are a style of yeast that ferments at a warmer temperature, and the yeast itself throws off a whole lot of compounds when it metabolizes the sugar and gives us alcohol and CO2. It also throws off a whole lot of compounds that can give beer flavor and aroma. Lager yeast tend to be a little bit more discreet, and they still give us CO2 and alcohol, but are a bit crisper and cleaner in what they leave behind. And so, yeah, just two fundamentally different branches of the beer tree.
Right, that's really interesting, and actually answers a question I had for you later. That's which I suppose you've answered now. Which is, how does yeast actually affect the beer?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, you could start off, you could make a beer with exactly the same malt and exactly the same hops and throw the different yeast in, and you'll come up with two very, very different tasting beers. You know, if you've got a dark beer like a German Schwarzbier, which is a black beer, it'll look like a Guinness or, look like a stout, and it'll have that roasty character, but it doesn't have the same, yeasty, fruity notes that perhaps a stout can sometimes have, and it tends to be a little bit lighter and crisper, whilst having some of the same overlapping flavors. It'll still have a very unique and distinct flavor just because of the yeast that's used.
Awesome. Thanks for those insights, Matt. So actually, one question that I want to ask you is, because everyone's got a subjective taste on what's good. So I don't want to ask you what's good. What I would like to ask you is what you really appreciate in a beer or a beer experience. What's that nice touch that just makes it for you?
Oh, look, you're right. It is a very, very personal thing. And to be honest, the thing I love about beer, and that sort of diverts a little away from, I think, what you're asking, but the thing that I love about beer is just ultimately so sociable. It's something that wine has a little bit of a stuffiness, and you're going to get emails about that. But historically, it's always been perceived. It's something that's made once a year. It's got there's a lot of emphasis on the year and the terroir and all of those sorts of things that just in their element can be a little bit alienating to drinkers. Beer is just something that is very, very everyday. It's very approachable, and it always has been, and that's what I love about it. We have seen the rise of craft beer and the rediscovery of styles that can have a whole lot of flavors. But I hate it when, I really discourage when beer starts to try and enter that realm of wine. So I just celebrate the really approachable, everyday nature of beer. And, that can encompass a whole different range of styles. But it's that element that I really celebrate and love.
Well, you mentioned with wine and beer, you said terroir. Can you just please quickly explain what that is? And then there, I have a question. My question really there is, can beer have terroir?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's a great question. And you're probably best, hopefully you won't get any wine sommeliers yelling at my explanation to terroir.
That's okay.
But terroir is a sense of place. And, wineries have traditionally, the winery has grown the grapes and made the wine all, in the one place. And so the wine expresses the place that it's grown in. And, I like to say that wine is a postcard from the place that it came from. And wine can stand travel, and it stands aging and all of those sorts of things. And so you can send wine around the world. Beer, on the other hand, it doesn't handle, traveling as well as wine does. In fact, the Germans have a lovely saying, only drink beer around the chimney. And that means that, every small village will have a brewery, a local brewery, and you can see that brewery's chimney from your house, and only drink the beer from that brewery where you can see the chimney. And that's a lovely concept. But it also means that because the ingredients for beer have historically been able to be shipped, you can send hops can only be grown commercially in a fairly narrow range of places. And so in Brisbane, if we weren't able to access hops grown for us, we wouldn't be able to make beer. So the ingredients of beer travel, but as a rule, beer itself doesn't travel. So if you look at that As you can probably tell, I can talk. So feel free to jump in
No, I'm very
if I'm not
interested in
answering the
hearing
question.
more. So this is good. Wherever we flow with it, I've got plenty more questions that are coming up anyway. So that's good. Please continue.
Cool. So yes, so wine, represents a place that the ingredients are grown and the wine is made. Whereas beer, you can have German hops, or you can have Tasmanian hops, or you can have North American hops being sent to you. You can have locally grown barley, or you can have malts that come in from England or Germany, depending on the style you want to make. So the beer itself doesn't really represent the place that any one ingredient was grown, because those you can have a real mishmash or United Nations of ingredients coming together to form the beer.
So
But what I like, sorry.
sorry, you said there you mentioned that hops can only be grown in a narrow range of places. Where are those places in the world? Is it a handful, or is it actually quite a great deal of places within a particular country, or
Well, it's a great deal of places, but it's a limited range of latitude. So
uh,
um, the hop plant itself needs a certain amount of daylight during its growing season. There are some other climate things that will affect it, but it's really down to the day length. And so, as the Earth tilts coming into the southern summer, our days get longer, and the perfect amount of sunlight is in a relatively narrow band of latitude, and that runs through Tasmania and Victoria, New Zealand. We are starting to see some South American hops and also some South African hops, but really it's Australia and New Zealand, Tasmania and New Zealand, and parts of Victoria. In the Northern Hemisphere, it's England, Germany, the Czech Republic, and going around to Northern California and places like Oregon. So it's a limited flat band of latitude. You can grow it elsewhere. There are a number of people who are growing hops in places like Brisbane, for example. You're just not going to get commercial yields because you're not going to get the plant isn't as vigorous and doesn't fruit as well.
A question I have there is I've heard recently about brewers using ground hops, or like a powdered hops. Apparently, they get more yield from it. Like, is that something that's been happening recently?
Yeah, look, I don't know hops probably as well as the chemistry and things as well as a real hop expert, but the hop is a fruit. It's often referred to as a flower, but it's actually the fruit of the hop vine, and in it are these little glands that have the amino acids and the essential oils that the brewer wants. So you've got these fine leaves to the fruit, or these fine sort of outer casings of it, that don't really add any flavour. They're just there holding it together. So brewers can use hop flowers, or the hop fruit, or they can use dried hops, which are just a preserved form of it, that have been compressed and dried. But depending on how they use it, then you can start getting some of the leaf characters and the tannins and some of the flavors that come from using whole hops. And so hop growers and the hop suppliers have started looking at ways that they can get the aroma that we love in modern craft beer and the bitterness components that they use, but extract them in a way that it makes it much more accurate. It takes some of the guesswork out for brewers, and it means beer has always been about consistency. Going back to wine, because we celebrate an annual vintage for wine, we're very accepting that year to year wine is going to taste different. Because a brewer can essentially take ingredients that were grown once a year but are stored throughout the year, he can make beer 365 days a year. We're much less forgiving of variation, batch to batch variation of beer. And so the hop powders are just a way that hop suppliers are trying to give a little bit more control to brewers without curbing their ability to extract full flavour that we come in craft beer, but also give them a little bit more control over consistency.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so it all really comes down to consistency and making sure that brewers can can have that or build more consistency into their brew.
Yeah.
The I'd like to ask you the $1 million question, Matt. And it's come up a couple of times already. What is craft beer?
Okay, look, yeah, I mean, God, you could write a essay, and there's millions and millions and millions of words of discussion about that. Look, craft beer is, in my opinion, largely a meaningless and means absolutely nothing and means absolutely everything,
Mm.
depending on where you're coming from. But if you look back 10 or 15 years, we saw a rise of very, very small brewers. And back when I started writing, they were called microbrewers, or
Hmm.
boutique brewers or whatever. And it was a term that meant that they were very, very small brewers. Coming out of that, because they were very small, they were targeting relatively small audiences, and that meant they didn't have to have the um, you know, anodyne, broad appeal beers that the multinational brewers had to go for. So that meant that they could start looking at some of the flavors of beer. There's some of the ingredients and the stylistic flavors that can come out that may not appeal to everybody, but will appeal to their limited audience.
Mm.
And they did so using less industrial because they were small. They didn't have the same industrial techniques. And so if you look at all of those things, independence, some traditional techniques, and more flavour-based beers, that started to coalesce into a phrase that the Americans called craft beer. And so craft beer has just become shorthand for something that is a little bit more flavour-based than what went before, and the brewers tend to be small and independent. But as we've seen the market grow and evolve, that meaning, or that specific meaning, has come to be less and less relevant.
Mm. It's the lines blurring between what a micro brewery is, and I suppose what your commercial or industrial size breweries are.
Well, we've seen one of the founding or one of the pioneering craft breweries, Sierra Nevada, in the US.
Mm.
You know, Coopers in Australia makes 80 something million litres, 5% of the total beer market. They're often seen as the third, the little brother to the big two.
Hmm.
I think they only sneak into the top 10 craft breweries in the US. So Sierra Nevada is 4 or 5 times bigger than Coopers, and yet they are still regarded as a craft brewery. And when you're starting to get
Mm.
that scale, you're really starting to get away from that notion of microbrewing, and they're brewing on a scale as big as like the 4X brewery in Australia.
Hmm.
So size starts to become less relevant. Ownership starts to become less relevant because you've got private equity firms that are multi-billion-dollar concerns investing in craft breweries, and we've seen that
Hmm.
with BrewDog and a couple of others recently. So, the idea of a husband and wife who cash in their superannuation and open a brewery is sometimes wrapped up in craft beer, and we're losing that as well. And we're also seeing some of the big bold styles that craft beer built its name on. We're starting to see craft brewers, bring out no carb beers or very light flavored beers that are targeting a broader market. So yes, we are starting to see a fairly dramatic blurring of the edges
Mm.
as to what craft beer is.
Mm. One definition I've heard is that it's only craft beer when it's been made purely from its four, fundamental ingredients. So like, obviously water, hops, malt, and yeast. But yeah, so that's an interesting way to look at it because I know that a lot of the big guys add adjuncts into their beer, don't they?
So do a lot of what inverted commas craft brewers.
Mm.
We've seen craft brewers, some really great craft brewers, Holgate in Victoria, which are nearly 20 years old and still a husband and wife team. Still boutique in the sense they make a chocolate stout or a
Mm.
chocolate porter made with vanilla beans and cocoa nibs.
Mm.
There are a lot of Belgian brewers who are regarded as the pioneers of craft beer who use a lot of sugar cane the same way the big brewers do. It's one of those things. If you're looking at adjuncts or the techniques that are being used, they use hop extracts as well. The big brewers use hop extracts as well, but that tends to be less about adding flavour and more about being able to put beer in clear glass bottles. So, it's one of those things that sometimes it comes down to the intention behind the use of the ingredient or the technique, but then that makes it impossible to define because you can't look into the heart of the brewer and tell exactly what their intention is.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I mean, I suppose we'll see some sort of emergence as to, there won't be a term craft beer eventually. Who knows?
Well, we've
Um,
seen the
mm,
Craft Beer Industry Association, which is the industry group for small brewers, and they're only 5 years old or so. And when they launched, they included the big brewers in their membership. And just recently, they voted to, change their constitution so the big guys can't be part of it, and they've changed their name to the Independent Brewers Association. And that seems to be where the tectonic plates are shifting. So the
mm,
big guys can make the big multinational breweries can make fantastic beer, but it comes down to, where the influence and the control of the industry is, and that seems to be around independence.
okay, cool. My next question is that I'm super interested in the business side of things. Now, you obviously see a lot of beers, and if you have them in a bar, they usually come in the same schooner, right? So, how can a business market their brand most effectively? Is it with the tap badge, the label? Is it anything else?
Look, I think all of that. Well, when you're talking about business, it can be really hard because you can, pick up a business textbook, apply every principle truly and effectively, and still fail if you don't inject it with your own personal, approach.
I call it.
But
My term for that is authenticity. I think you have to be 100% authentic with what you do, just being
it,
honest and congruent.
exactly.
Yeah.
And look, and that's a perfect way to describe it. So yeah, so I mean, I think particularly at the moment when you've got craft beer is seen, you've got the mainstream media writing about the craft beer phenomenon and the craft beer explosion and the craft beer boom. That draws a lot of people into it, and they think, well, shit, if I stick, sorry, I hope
No,
that
that's
didn't hurt
okay.
your
No,
G rating.
I've sworn on it before. It's okay.
If I stick craft beer on, I'm going to, people are just going to flock to my brewery, to my bar, and that's just not going to happen.
Mm,
And or certainly it may have 4 or 5 years ago when we saw the very first craft breweries, the craft beer bars spring up. They
mm,
were new or novel, and that you could get away with some of your other practices, even just of not having good stock control and those sorts of things. But I think you really, if you're working in the beer space, if you're a brewery, I think too many people look on craft beer and forget that it's actually the craft beer business.
mm,
And I think that I can just sort of make great beer and that'll do it. And same with venues. They think that they forget that they are in the hospitality business, and you can't put the craft in craft beer ahead of the business side of what you do.
So having that, I think, that business acumen should be an integral part an integral part of people's process when they also think about the creativity behind creating a product.
Absolutely. And I mean, to be honest, when you asked me to come on the show, I just sort of thought that I was the least qualified person because, in your very first show, when you were talking about what it was that you wanted to do, you listed all of the startups you'd been involved in. And, look, it was a real balls to the wall approach of creating something and sort of getting it out there and selling it. And that's I've been very lucky. I've been to some extent made my own luck, but also been caught up in um, the currents that I immersed myself in. And I've never gone to the bank and sort of said, can I borrow $50,000 or $100,000 because here's my vision for creating a beer news website. Everything I've done has been very much organic.
Yeah,
And
we call that bootstrapped in the startup world. Yeah, but in another, sorry to interrupt you there. I was going to say in another sense, like that actually shows that it has value. If you can do it without having to raise capital for it, it means that it's brought such immense value quickly that you haven't needed to raise capital.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's been, as I said, I've been doing it for 15 years, so I'm certainly not an overnight success. And even now, I'm not sort of a breakthrough success where you suddenly, go large. But and I have really reflected on when you asked me to come on what I can add to people who are genuine entrepreneurs. And like if you wanted to get some really dynamic entrepreneurial guys, Dan Norris, who is part of Black Hops Brewing on the Gold Coast, he is a hardcore entrepreneur, and he's somebody who really has strong views about entrepreneurship. I guess.
I
Sorry.
follow them on Instagram. I love the Black Hops Instagram. They've always pumping out their dailies. So yeah, I'd love to have a chat with Dan. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, and like he's so deeply enmeshed in, and he's written books on entrepreneurship, and he's somebody who really has strong opinions on. I think his book is 7 Day Startup, where if you've got an idea and you get your business going in 7 days, do that. And that's not me. Like I've gone, and the great thing is that I've managed to see, by going very very slowly, I've let the market tell me what's needed. But if if you invest heavily and if your business owes you money, I've often had day jobs. When I first started, I've had day jobs, and so that meant that I had an independent income source while I was gradually letting it going. And then a little bit later, I was working as a stay-at-home dad, and that gave me the ability to I wanted to earn income, but it wasn't my primary goal, and so I was able to fit in around those things. So I was very very lucky that I was able to structure my business to my circumstances, but in return that let me structure what I was doing to what was working and take it very very slowly, and that's let me pivot. Oh no, actually pivot is a little bit too dramatic. Just tweak and shape and mold based on where I saw the demand. Whereas if you suddenly decide throw in your day job and you've got a $50,000 loan and you need to pay that back and you need to sort of you've got business space, then your business owes you every day you're thinking about profit and loss and paying debt and those sorts of things. And in a little way, you've got your compromises are magnified by that, and particularly having staff. If you've got to pay staff every day, you need to start then thinking what compromises have I got to make sure that this pay comes in. And sometimes your vision gets compromised by the need to make money on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, there are a lot more responsibilities involved and things to consider with that. But you mentioned there there's two things you brought up there. Obviously, it's the goal. Everyone wants to structure their work around their life because they want to live first and then work second to that. I hope, unless you can merge the two and work. Do something that you love, which obviously you're doing, and I certainly do myself. I love what I do as well. So that's fantastic that you've been able to create that. The other thing that you mentioned there was looking at having that customer centricity about what you do, and I think that's something that's taught in a lot of well, it has been since really Eric Ries talked about in the Lean Startup, which is a process known as, or a method known as the Agile method or the Lean Startup method, which is doing that. It's saying, what does the customer want? Iterate. Or ask them again, what do they want? Or iterate. And it's this smaller process of going, oh, okay, what do they want on a small scale? How can we make something closer to that? And then ask them again. And you've gone, from what you've described, gone through that and looked at the customer first, which is the person that ultimately a business sells to. So if their customer's not going to want it, why would they create it in the first place? So,
Yeah, well, look, you've just taught me something very, very interesting, because I didn't know that. Again, I just did what was relevant to me at the time, and to some extent, if there is a theory behind that, I discovered that accidentally because it was what was possible. So I'll have to get the details of that book off you and read it
Yeah,
to
no
find out
problem.
what it is that I've done and how I could have even done that better.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem. The next question I have for you, Matt, is obviously you've been, as we mentioned a couple of times, working in the industry a while, and we've talked about a lot of the developments that you've seen while you've been in the industry. You know, the sorts of craft breweries that have popped up, and we talked about yeast in beer. I did have another question about yeast after I had a Brett Yeast beer by Feral, which was fantastic. It was the Funk and Fresh. I don't know if you've had it yourself, but I love this beer. And it wasn't the sort of tart sour that I'd expect with the name, and compared to other sours that I'd previously had. But sours are this thing that I've noticed in the market more recently. Is there anything you'd like to comment on sours at all?
Look, they're a terrific beer. I mean, it's funny. I love the fact that, you know, a significant part of human history has been trying to remove sour flavors from our food,
Mm.
and cleaning up flavors. And suddenly, when beer had become so bland and anodyne, that we went looking for some of these traditional flavors. And for a long time, sour beers were pretty much isolated to parts of Belgium, where they had been celebrated and revered. And it was just the fact that they did live there, and they held out in this one little bastion, that they were still there for people to rediscover.
Mm.
And I love that. And unfortunately, it's one of those things that we see things die out. And once upon a time, Cooper's Sparkling Ale was pretty much what every brewery had, but as tastes change, they almost all die out. And we're just very, very lucky that every now and then a brewery like Cooper's manages to, through luck and circumstance and, just good management sometimes, stay around. So when tastes change back again, they're there to act as a model. And sours is one of those uh, um, things that has suddenly been there for us to rediscover, and I think it's terrific.
Cool. Thanks for your insights on sours there, Matt. The next question I have is on obviously people talk about this, and it's a bit of a joke sometimes, amongst beer nerds. But what is a sessionable beer?
Um, yeah, look, I don't like the style. Again, for somebody who makes I don't like the name. For somebody who has made a living, selling alcohol in its purest form, I still really advocate for the responsibility around it. But so the idea of the session has so many negatives associated with it because, like smashable is probably even a worse term
Mm,
for Mike. But I'm a little bit of an outsider there.
that's all right.
You know,
The one that
but
you
in terms of
sorry.
sessionable, you're looking at a beer that one isn't enough, that you can sort of sit down and hopefully drink it responsibly. But you
Mm.
can have 2 or 3 pints over an extended period of time, and drinking the beer isn't the focus. Often it's the liquid backdrop to the sociability of beer that I talked about a little bit earlier.
The reason that I wanted to ask that first question is because I've seen a lot of session IPAs come up, and so I wanted to ask your opinion on the session IPA, and because obviously I believe it's just really more of a marketing tool for a sort of an easier to drink IPA, really.
Oh, James, well, you're spot on. I mean, it's almost a tautology because in the modern incarnation, and IPA is a historical name, but the modern beer, whilst it traces its lineage back, it's nothing like what the historical one was. And it was a very hop forward, quite aggressively bitter beer.
Mm.
If you're going a lower, bitter, like a smaller version of that, it was the American style pale ale, like Little Creatures or Sierra Nevada. But you can't cut the style cake really, really cleanly. So there's a little bit of bleeding across that. Um, the uh, you know IPAs have never sold really well as well in Australia as they have in America. They've never been as big a part of the market.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's also, as I said to you before, beer had become very generic to appeal to the widest variety of the market. And, if the more flavour anything has, the more self-limiting the market has become, because you're going to alienate a lot of people. And that's why vanilla ice cream is the best-selling ice cream in the world. But if you ask anybody what their favourite ice cream is, if they were given any choice, it wouldn't be vanilla. It's just
No.
one of those things. So IPAs are really exciting and have appeal, but not appeal to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my view, we've seen a movement back where brewers have realised that, yeah, we can have these IPAs. They create a lot of excitement. It's a flashing red light over our range, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not for everybody. So we'll create something that has all of the excitement and cachet of an IPA, but it's really more of what I call an unbalanced American pale ale, because it's still got a bolder hop flavour than Little Creatures, for example, which is
Yeah.
the distinctive format, but it's still not as bold as an IPA. So it's trying to be a little, and it's also lower alcohol, because in Australia, alcohol is punished under the excise regime. So a 6.5-7% IPA is going to cost a lot more. So we can bring it back down to like a 5% ABV, not have the same excise bill, and hopefully make it a little bit more drinkable, so we can move more units, which is ultimately their aim.
Okay, cool. My next point on the innovations that I've sort of potentially or developments that I've seen more recently or coming up is the gluten-free beer. So obviously the process is different between Australia and overseas, but as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong. Is this something you know a bit about, gluten-free beer?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I mean, gluten-free is one of the health crazes of the moment.
Mm.
And I mean, I'm not an expert, but in my relatively uninformed understanding, 1% of the population is actually gluten intolerant. Um, you know, the proteins that in gluten, maybe affect a few more without them actually being a celiac.
Mm.
But then, because it's suddenly become a bit of a buzzword, everyone suddenly identifies with wanting to have a gluten-free lifestyle, and that
Okay.
creates a market. Gluten-free beers. There have been a couple of ways that you could make gluten-free beers. One is use base grains that have sugars that you can ferment, but don't have gluten.
Mm.
And there's spelt and sorghum, and there's a range of things. The problem with that is that the beer is not going to taste like beer. It's a little bit like
Mm.
saying, look, I'm allergic to apple juice, so I'm going to use pears. It's a really bad analogy, but it's you can't make
Mm. It's still
apple
it's
cider out
mm.
of pears and have it taste like apple cider.
Yeah.
So beer made from grains other than barley or even wheat is going to have a slightly different flavour to traditional beer, but you can still make a really pleasantly flavoured beer that just tastes a little bit different, that caters to it.
Do you have any examples of gluten-free beer that you've had that's tasted good?
Yeah, look, there have been a couple from a brewery. Let me see. I think it's O'Brien's, actually, maybe it wasn't O'Brien's, but there are a couple. There aren't many, and the problem with that is because the gluten-free grains aren't mainstream malted. Quite
Mm.
often, they are very, very expensive, and you don't get the benefits of scale and having a big scale maltings. And a lot of craft brewers are malting them themselves, and that's very, very expensive. And so, even just a fairly traditional mainstream lager is going to cost you over $100 a carton, and that then unless you really want a beer, it puts it a little bit out of your price range.
Okay. We've heard a bit about I've heard a bit about East Coast versus West Coast recently. They're obviously with the United States, but is the hops actually different between them, and what is the difference between an East Coast beer and a West Coast beer?
Look, this is where you get yourself in trouble. To speak in really, really broad brush, West Coast tends to be much more hop focused, where you've just got the big, brash, bold citrus aromas and a fairly assertive bitterness.
Mm-hmm.
East Coast tend to have a little bit more focus on the malt as well, so it's a little bit more, dare I say, balanced. But we've also seen a new player emerge, which is the, faddish beer, which is the New England Pale Ale, which is, I don't know if you've seen them, they look like orange juice. They're incredibly cloudy, and that's now seen as a very distinctive third branch of the American IPA style.
I think I tried a New England Pale Ale once, but I can't remember what it was. I wish I could remember. Just to tie into this here, because you've mentioned different types of beers. There was something I heard more recently about Stone and Wood taking Matilda Bay to court about the wild ale. About their wild yak, because they were saying no one could
No,
call it a wild. Is that right?
no, so Stone and Wood Pacific Ale. Okay,
Oh,
so
sorry, it's a pack
Stone
ale, of
and Wood,
course.
yeah, Pacific Ale. So Stone and Wood, I think 9 years ago launched, and they came up with a beer that was a little bit similar to some styles, but ultimately, a very, very distinct beer in the Australian market, and it was pretty much the use of Galaxy hops that gave it that really signature bold passion fruit over what might otherwise have been an English summer ale or a low bitter Australian pale ale. But it was very, very distinctive in the market, and it became very, very popular. I need to say at the outset, I need to be a little bit careful what I say, James. I was actually called as an expert witness in the
Oh, I see.
in the passing off case, so I can speak generically or fairly broadly about it. So it became very, very popular. A lot of brewers started creating a similar style because you can't trademark a beer style. But Stone and Wood sought to trademark the name Pacific Ale. And everyone seemed, generally, the Australian craft brewing industry seemed to respect that Pacific Ale was something that Stone and Wood created, and they were going to leave that. There's one brewer in Melbourne who felt that Pacific Ale was a style, not a trademark. So he opposed them. I understand he opposed their trademark application, and he also brought out a Pacific Ale, a beer called Pacific Ale. And so Stone and Wood brought an action initially because the trademark hadn't been approved. They had to go through the lengthy process of defending their right to use the trademark. They essentially argued in the federal court that the other brewery was passing off and trying to pass off their beer as Stone and Wood Pacific Ale in the marketplace. And that was where I was called as the witness. And ultimately, Stone and Wood was unsuccessful in the passing off. But the trademark case is still going on. And Stone and Wood has also appealed the passing off decision. So there's a whole lot of legal stuff that's, I think it's not far off being declared.
Right.
Now, Matilda Bay comes into it because... sorry, there's no such thing as a short answer when I'm concerned.
That's okay.
So Matilda Bay comes into it because Matilda Bay was owned by CUB that back in 4 or 5 years ago was purchased by SAB Miller. SAB Miller had been in partnership with Coca-Cola Amatil to have a business called Pacific Beverages, and that was where they had Blue Tongue, and a couple of other beers. And because they had the Pacific Beverages trademark, when Stone and Wood went to register the Pacific Ale trademark, they had a little bit of negotiation, and I believe that the agreement was that CUB wouldn't oppose Stone and Wood's Pacific Ale trademark so long as they reserve their rights to be able to use it effectively. And so so there's no trademark conflict between CUB and the Matilda Bay Pacific Ale and Stone and Wood because of that accommodation. That said, I still think, even though they had the right to, and this is purely my personal view now, even though they had the right to use it, I thought it was really, it sort of showed a real lack of originality on Matilda Bay's part, that just because you've got the right to use something, everyone else in the industry was quite happy to, recognise Stone and Wood's rights. And it just shows how unimaginative some of the big brewers can
Mm.
sometimes be. Also, a lot of brewers were creating beers that tasted like Wild Jack, and it's a stupid name because it does sound like like it should be a sour beer.
Yeah.
The fact that they brought out this Wild Jack that was Wild Jack Pacific Ale, it just showed a real lack of originality for what is otherwise a pretty decent beer.
Mm. It sounds a bit like the case. This is totally separate, but it's like the case between Cadbury and Darrell Lee about their color, the color purple. Cadbury tried to
Exactly, yeah.
trademark their purple. Yeah, so it sounds just like that. Was it Stone and Wood has
Did
applied for the trademark?
and were Cadbury able to get the purple? I thought they pretty much were able to get that, or maybe when it's used in with the type font, or yeah, but it's pretty much exactly the
Mm.
same thing. So Stone and Wood still have their trademark application on foot.
Hmm.
I believe that's going to be determined by the Intellectual Property Australia fairly soon,
Hmm.
but they've also got their appeal about passing off, which is, and that's where that purple, if another chocolate maker used the same purple as Cadbury, then Cadbury's was saying, well, you're trying to get people who aren't looking closely to buy your product thinking it's ours. And that's pretty much what I think, a very non-legal technical definition of passing off is.
Mm. That is interesting. I'd like to read up a bit more on that. What's my question for you now is what innovations have you seen happening in the industry?
Well, see, it depends what you mean by innovation. Innovation's bandied around a little bit, and in a sense, Pacific Ale I thought was an innovation because they came out with something that was very distinctive for what anyone else was doing, particularly in the craft beer space, because at that stage everyone was on a bit of a hop arms race and going for the IPAs that we talked about. This was
Mm.
before session IPAs came back. And they came out with a beer that had that lovely tropical passion fruit hop aroma, but in a much lower, approachable, sessionable style beer. It was 4%, 4.4% alcohol, and it was just such a clever beer at the time. In terms of innovation, look, I think, the brewers that are innovative, and this comes back to the question when we were talking about terroir. I think we got sidetracked from what my actual answer in terms of terroir with beer.
Mm.
I don't think beer has a terroir because you can send ingredients around the world, and there are very few estate brewers anywhere in the world. And I think there's maybe one in the country, or a few that are starting to grow their own hops, but very few are doing their barley as well. So a beer doesn't reflect the flavors that come from where it's grown. And you can brew a beer style anywhere in the world, but I think the styles that resonate in any one place are what I call cultural terroir, and that is beers that spring up shaped by what beer drinkers want.
Mm.
I was in London recently, and in one sense, you land in London, and there's this wellspring of new craft breweries, as we've seen in Australia, but they're all doing a pale ale. They're doing a Goza, which is a German, slightly sour, salty beer. They're doing sour beers, and pretty much everyone is doing beers that 5 years ago or 10 years ago were distinctive. But if you go to America, you can taste the same beer because the same hops and everything are being used. If you go to England, if you go to Australia, fundamentally, you can taste the same beer just in a different country.
Mm.
But in that same pub, you can taste a thing like an English cask ale. And that's something that is largely unique to England. And it brings in their history, it brings in their culture, it brings in their, sort of techniques of pouring beer. And
Mm.
that has been preserved. And that's something that I see is coming out of the cultural terroir. You can't have, 10-degree flat beers in Brisbane when it's 34 degrees. And I happen to be over there in the heat wave that London recently had. And on a day when it was 18 degrees, those beers were just delightful. On the 34-degree day in a pub that doesn't have air conditioning because they're not used to having 34-degree days, a beer at 8 to 10 degrees that was flat was almost, you had to force yourself to drink it. And you had flavor, but you didn't have refreshment and you didn't have enjoyment that comes with that beer being in
Mm.
the context. So you're
Mm.
never going to get something like real ale springing up in cans in Queensland or even Brisbane.
Yeah, the way that you just described beer there reminded me of something else. It's kind of similar in a way to wine, without saying it doesn't have, while also saying it doesn't have terroir. Um, and you commented on the new James Bogue beers that they've got, which is sort of in a way replacing like that the fine dining wine with beer instead. So what is it that you thought about those guys and the similarities between wine and beer there, and even that they could be substitutes for that experience?
Yeah, look, and that there is a point that they overlap, but and you can do beer and food matching, and beer and food, and in some things, I think beer is a much better match than wine. But beer will never replace wine because, as I said, if you go back, quite apart from the fact that they are fundamentally different, you can make wine once a year. These days you can preserve fruit juice and make it at any time of the year, but that's not regarded as the traditional wine. Whereas beer you can make any time of the year. So fundamentally, we view them as being very, very different.
Mm.
Um, it also means that the price points and the marketing and all that's built into it, beer is much more of a unit cost game. It's a lower margin beer, and it's never going to have the romance and the elegance of wine, even though there's going to be these specialty beers that have some really complex flavors and can work beautifully. And I've done this thing called beer tapas, where I've tried to encourage people to drink much, rather than order a bottle of beer, like a 330 ml bottle of beer, um, amongst two or three people, and everybody have a 110 ml sample. So that way you're having smaller serves of 5 or 6 beers rather
Mm.
than a full bottle of smaller ones.
Mm, which is, I suppose, why the flights are popular at the moment as well. Where in a lot of craft breweries or even or the microbreweries or craft breweries, but smaller craft bars, craft beer bars, where they have a lot of flights where you taste, say, four different ones.
Yeah, and you can do that with tap beer, and that's one of
Mm.
the things that we're seeing, and that's where, you know, um, you do have you order a glass of wine, and that's 150 ml serve. You don't have to order the bottle, um, and up until recently, you didn't have wine on tap, whereas beer you had tap beers, and you could pour any amount of those, so you could have anything from a taster right through to a jug.
Mm.
Um, but if you bought the bottle, once the bottle was open, you had to buy the bottle, and so there was a barrier to, then you may have 8 beer taps, but 150 bottles of beer, and turning those over was a trap.
Mm.
And people may not try a 8 or 9, 10, $12 bottle of beer, or a 15, $20 bottle of beer that they haven't tried, lest that they don't like it.
Mm.
Or also, some of the really flavoursome beers are much higher alcohol, or just the really big flavours. You may not want to sit down and settle in to a big beer, and also publicans can't turn over the big beers as quickly.
Mm. The I was just thinking of yeah, I was just thinking of my experiences in bars and actually thinking about how whether it's going to be more costly to, obviously it's more costly to set up some more taps, and I was learning about the piping system in breweries, and the Python being like the main pipe that carries all of the pipes from the cold room. But I think that's something I'll have to research myself and sort of sit on for a while. I don't have any specific questions on that at the moment. But what's the best way for people to learn more about beer?
Oh, look, like anything, I mean, depending on how serious, how deeply invested you are in learning. A great expression I heard once was beer is fractally interesting. So,
Mm.
the deeper you dig, it just sort of keeps turning in on itself, and you can learn more and more and more. And,
So true.
yeah, and it's funny, like the longer, the more I've gone, when I first started writing, I thought, I knew everything. And, it's embarrassing, every, year you sort of get embarrassed by what you thought you knew. And it is just so deep. So to answer your question, um, if you just have a passing interest in beer and you like it, seeing the styles of beer, be willing to buy a beer that maybe you don't like.
Hmm.
And if you don't like it, try and describe to yourself what the flavors are,
Mm.
and don't hesitate to sort of not like a beer. It doesn't mean it's a bad beer. It just means it doesn't suit your palate.
Mm.
Or the other thing I find is sometimes if you don't understand why that flavor's there, and particularly with sour beers, we've grown up being told that something that is sour is wrong.
Mm.
And if you leave your orange juice in the fridge, you know, a week past its use by date, you can drink it and it's not going to kill you, but it's going to be sour. You can feel that outward because it's fermenting.
Mm.
And it's not going to make you sick or anything like that generally, but you're just going to get a little bit of fermentation in it. And we're told that that is bad.
Mm.
Um, Whereas beer has been, or wine or cider, they're spoiled grapes or spoiled apples or spoiled barley, but they've been artfully spoiled.
Mm.
And sometimes it's just understanding, in the terms of a sour beer, why this thing that in one circumstance you're told is bad, in another circumstance is celebrated. And that's where, you can start reading and learning a little bit more and trying to understand. And that's where maybe buying books or reading websites or going along to a beer tasting and asking
Mhm.
questions can really, really help.
Yeah, my personal way, I think, would be to is sort of using that idea of the beer tasting and going along to microbreweries and saying, "Can I please taste the beer? Like, what can I taste?" And then end up getting what you like out of it, and drink a schooner, a pint, or a pot, or whatever you'd like, even just a pony if you'd like. Um, so that's my way, is
Absolutely.
just to taste everything.
Yeah, and look, and that brings in a good thing. A lot of people, I've become um, more pragmatic as I've gone on because when you start, big guys are bad and small guys are good and tap contracts, and there is a continuum, and it's very hard to say in any one circumstance that you can bolt on. But Dan Murphy's has its place in terms of getting a lot of beer out to a lot of people at a price, and you're never going to get like a little boutique bottle shop on every corner. And Dan Murphy serves a purpose. But at
Mm.
the same time, you can't walk into Dan Murphy's and get really good explanation or say, I really like this, and get a really good recommendation the way that you can at, like my favorite bottle shop in Brisbane is Craft. Now, I don't work for them or anything like that, but you've got a team of people who, if you go in and say, I tried this wine or this cider or this beer, and I really liked it. What should I try? And they'll ask a few questions, and they'll be able to engage with you about the beer because
Mm.
they curate their selection and they can tell you about it, but then they can also take you on the next step of your journey. Um, and there is a really important place for people like that where you can ask and engage. And reading a book only gives you so much. It's just like if you're trying to teach yourself word processing, there's a
Mm.
lot of fumbling and you never learn it quite as well as if you sit down beside somebody and they talk you through it and you can engage and ask questions while you're experiencing it. And that's where a really good bar with really knowledgeable, unjudging staff or a really
Mm.
great bottle shop can really advance your knowledge and fuel your passion.
Totally, it's that the human resource component of it in learning, and having a really a beer mentor, I think, is the best way to look at it.
Yeah, look, I like to say, and the motto for my website is beer is a conversation.
Yeah.
Wine is a lecture, beer is a conversation. And, whether it's a group of people sitting around having a conversation and enjoying a beer, or rather than having the wine guy up the end telling you that you're going to get hints of gooseberry and wet granite, sitting down and getting to sort of back and forth and have a conversation about a beer and learn that way. And it's that conversational element that I love about beer.
That's really interesting. I like that one too. There are a lot of events around. What sort of events or beer events would you recommend going to learn more about beer? I know that
Um,
there's one coming up with the Brisbane Beer Barons, and I'm actually looking at hosting one through the show, which will be I'm sort of going through the planning of that at the moment, a beer event. So, what would you recommend going to?
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, they come in many shapes and forms. We're seeing, an industry springing up to provide beer festivals, for example. And look, I think anything where you can engage with the brewer is a good thing. Although, I always feel, brewers are very passionate and they love to talk about their beer, but there's always an element of being at a Tupperware party because,
Yeah.
you know, you're being sold to as much as you're being educated.
Mm.
And so always bear that in mind. So, they're selling you something whilst they're educating you. And, so always have a bit of skepticism in the background. But beer festivals where there's a brewer or beer dinners where there's a tasting and the brewer or the sales rep or the beer ambassador is there to talk a little bit about the beer, they have knowledge about the product as well. And so if you are smelling passion fruit or you're tasting clove or any of those sorts of things, they'll be able to tell you what it is that you're getting, and that's a great educational thing. Just going to, as I said, a small bottle shop, or they often have tastings, and the knowledgeable staff will do it, or tap takeovers where the brewer's there. They're fantastic. And yeah, I mean, just finding groups of people. Look, and this is where I get myself into trouble sometimes. There's a whole lot of, chat rooms and forums online where you've got a whole lot of people who are enthusiastic and have great passion, but opinions that outstretch their knowledge.
Mm.
As I say, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. And they've read a lot of stuff, that they've got the knowledge. This is the correct serving temperature. And I've had arguments recently with, not arguments, but discussions, active discussions with people who, land-based people for refrigerating glasses, or, telling them this is the temperature you should be serving it at. Try telling somebody in cans that you don't chill your glass before you serve it. Yes, there are a whole lot of good practices, but sometimes you can let knowledge get in the way of, the wisest way or the best way, or, ultimately drinking beer is a hedonistic pleasure. It's not an intellectual pursuit. So, you know whether you're enjoying it or not. And, if you let it, as I said, let your beer warm up to 10 degrees because that's how real ale's served, and you're not enjoying it, then you're actually doing it the wrong way, in my sometimes not so humble opinion.
That's all right. Thanks for all your insights. I've only got two quick little questions to wrap up the show today. What have your best resources been to build your knowledge base?
Look, as I said, going right back to the very start, I discovered very quickly that, when one of the things I wrote about was beer, if you said that to a brewer, it was a little bit like, in Wayne's World, where they've got the access all areas pass and they're ushered around the back, and, they get to meet the Alice Cooper and We're Not Worthy and ask questions. And obviously not everyone can have that. But when you're at the brewery, or, at the brewery bar, ask questions. Be willing to say, I don't know, and ask questions. Look, there's a website called the Crafty Pint that is actually in, not competition. Well, it's competition, but it's healthy competition with Australian Brews News that I edit. But it is one of the best resources for anyone that wants to learn the backstory of breweries and beers in the country. And it's one that I use all the time. And, go to that. And if you try a beer, odds are it's going to be written about there. I personally don't find things like Untapped and Rate Beer and Beer Advocate great resources, in the same way that I don't find necessarily that, what if, so some of the booking places great, because you don't know who the person is and what their personal preferences are when they're rating something. So look, so long as you know that the source that you're getting the information from has some level of authority, and you take any vested interest that they've got with a grain of salt, you can learn a lot. But really, as I said, sit down and ask questions with people who know what they're talking about.
And on that, to get multiple opinions, because when say you listen to one person giving you their opinion on a particular beer, then to ask someone else, ask someone else, and then you get this common denominator between them, and that's this intersection of knowledge that I believe when we learn about all sorts of things, that's that common denominator, that core knowledge to what it is, and it's probably going to be the correct knowledge if all these people who have different tastes and opinions and interests, if that's what they're saying, that's probably the most correct thing.
Yeah, although, and yeah, look, as with everything, like I mean, that's a good rule of thumb, but there's always an exception to every rule, and sometimes you get a little bit of groupthink or herd
This is true.
mentality creeping in, and for a long time there was the received wisdom about what an IPA was and the style and things like that, and then people started, because it was just water cooler knowledge, and then people started going back and researching it deeply, and we discovered that the stories that we had were completely wrong. And you do get a little bit, uh, you know, this is a great beer or this is a bad beer, because there's a lot of hype and excitement around it, or styles or things. And so always be willing to question and form your own opinion. And if people are saying this is a fantastic beer and you don't enjoy it, don't hesitate to question whether or not you enjoy it. And on that, before you pronounce upon a beer and say, look, this is a terrible beer, ask yourself, is it a bad beer, or is it just a beer that I don't like? It does have characteristics that I don't like. And sometimes, and those two things aren't always the same.
And growing to learn what does really make a good beer or bad beer is a matter of, I suppose, education, really.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and it is, and that's where it's fractally interesting, and going back to what I say, beer should be something that you don't know anything about, and if you pick it up and enjoy it, it's fantastic. But then you can just start digging deeper and deeper and deeper into why you enjoy it. But that, the study of it hopefully doesn't become the reason for the enjoyment. Hopefully the simple pleasure of a great beer, whatever form that takes, is where the pleasure comes.
Just remembering that it is, in the end, it is a beer. It's to be enjoyed, as you said, over a conversation.
Exactly, exactly.
What's next on the cards for you, Matt? And then this is my last question.
Oh yeah. Oh well. So, and having taken forever for all of my other answers, look, there's a lot happening, and it's really exciting and really gratifying after years and years and years of sort of knocking on restaurant doors saying, let's do a beer dinner or things. We're really starting to see it, and I'm fortunate enough to be involved in a lot of different events. But we've got coming up this weekend, and I think this will go to air in time. We've got the French Festival, which wine and champagne are regarded as being French things. And I'm getting to do a tasting of some French beers and pairing it with French cheese. And that's really, really exciting. The following weekend, we've got regional flavours, and it is just one of the biggest, best food events that Brisbane has. And for the last 5 years, they have been incredibly supportive of small independent beer and not just selling the porridge rights the way a lot of big food festivals do to a big multinational, and so I'm involved in that. And after that, we've got the exhibition where I don't want to keep spruiking and plugging. If anyone is interested, and I haven't sort of alienated everybody with my long-winded answers, and want to find out a little bit more, and come and have a chat over a beer, just jump on beermat.com, and you'll generally find what I'm involved in. Or jump on Facebook and follow me on Facebook on Good Beer Matt, and you'll see what I'm involved in. Come along and have a beer.
Yeah, awesome. Matt, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show. You've had some awesome insights and many little sayings that I'll be writing down there. Like wine is a postcard is more of a postcard of the vineyard. And oh man, there was one close to the end there. That's just one that really rung through with me. So there are a bunch that I'm going to be writing down. But thank you very much for being on the show today.
My pleasure, James. And mate, look, thank you very much, and all the best with the podcast. I've really been enjoying listening to it, and as I said, I'm in awe of. I don't regard myself as an entrepreneur as such, but I'm gonna have to read that book and find out whether I am. But congratulations. I hope this continues to go strength to strength.
Thank you very much. If you liked what you heard today, please subscribe on iTunes and SoundCloud or on the Libsyn website. I'll put the links up. If you'd like to get in touch, my email is hospopreneurs@gmail.com. I've got plenty of fantastic episodes coming up. Got some cool stuff planned. I'm still planning a wine episode for all you wine fans out there. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you soon. Cheers.